Hello all, and welcome back to Reasons to Believe. It's a great blessing for me to be with all of you, and I look forward to today's conversation, today's lecture, which is going to be on classical arguments for the existence of God. Now, before we begin, I want to do a little bit of a summary from where we've been up until now. So I've been very careful in setting out the foundation for talking about God because there's a lot of preliminary work that we needed to do. So first of all, we have to take seriously the idea of truth itself and whether or not it's still possible to talk about truth. And I hope you were convinced. I hope you're convinced that it is. And then we had to look at the relationship between faith and reason and to see how both faith is related to reason and how faith is different from reason. And the argument that I made, which again is I'm just conveying the truth of the Catholic faith to you, these are not my arguments, is that faith sort of precedes reason as the buttress of reason itself, and then reason has its own kind of domain, and then faith is on the other side. The point being that not only are faith and reason complementary, but that we need both of them in order to speak theologically or really any other way. And last time we looked at the relationship between faith and science, or reason and science, and came to the conclusion that contrary to popular assumptions, not only is science something that no faithful person, no Catholic has to have any fear of whatsoever, but science can also be a great tool in helping us to understand and to deepen our faith, while we also recognize that science has very strict limits in what it is capable of doing. And one thing that it cannot do, nor should try to do, is to prove the existence of God, particularly when we're speaking about God in the way we're going to be speaking about Him today. So that has all been preparatory work. This has been kind of like a tease, right? I promise we're actually going to talk about God. I promise we're actually going to get some substance here. Well, today I'm going to try and deliver, to put putting some meat on the theological bones that we have, that we've been putting here. Or I guess if you're a vegetarian, putting some crunch in your theological carrot. I'm not sure exactly how that works. Okay, so the classical arguments for God's existence. Now, I'm not just going to jump in. I hope that you know me by now. I've got to set the table to make sure we do things just right. The first question we have to ask when we're beginning to address the question of can we actually demonstrate or prove or reasonably come to the conclusion that God does in fact exist is to ask the question, well, is metaphysics actually even possible? Isn't God ineffable? Now, ineffable means isn't God beyond all of our language and all of our capacity to conceive of who God is? Meaning, in a literal sense, we can't say anything about God because if we say something about God, we're necessarily saying something that's false because God is that which cannot be described. God is that which cannot fit within any kind of concept. So, well, what is metaphysics then? If I ask the question, can we do it? We have to understand what it is. Well, metaphysics most basically is the study of the nature of reality as such, including the nature of ultimate reality. So basically what it means is to do metaphysics is to try and figure out how everything works together and then to step back one step from there and say, and how is it all in existence and why? So we're asking, metaphysics is just right up touching the limits of theology. We're asking some of the largest questions you can possibly ask. Now, contrary to popular assumptions, and this includes, and I see some students here of the academy, this includes popular assumptions in higher education right now. Metaphysics is not dead. There's been a false narrative that we can trace all the way back to the period of the Enlightenment when religious thought really came under a very, very close scrutiny, which is nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But it did lead to the conclusion that, which is the one that's still dominant today, is that, well, no, we can't say anything about God. And so even our attempts should be aborted at the very beginning. We can't come to any possible conclusion. And one of the ways that we've seen this and again, especially for those of you who are joining us from the university today, one of the ways we especially see this is a pulling back from philosophy, a pulling back from metaphysics, and then just an immersion into different kinds of contexts. So people saying things like, well, I can't say anything about whether or not God exists, but I'm going to tell you my story, or I'm going to tell you our story, or I'm going to speak from my particular experience or our particular experience. Now again, if you're in higher education right now, that's very familiar to you. It has to do with this assumption that there's no longer any way to speak universally about the existence of God or the nature of God. And I'm here to tell you today, that's just not the case. So metaphysics lives, it's still alive. But we have to take into account the critiques that have been offered, because they're serious critiques. These are serious challenges to even the attempt to try and define the existence of God. And they fall into two basic camps. One is what I'm calling the philosopher's critique. And this one goes all the way back to the earliest attempts within philosophy to try to begin to define God and the possibility of the existence of God. So we're talking ancient Greek philosophy at this point. And one of those critiques takes this form. We can't speak about God using a word called univocally. Now what that means is that any word we use to speak about the existence of God necessarily will not be describing God, right? So for example, if I say, well, God is great, someone can ask me, okay, great like what? Great like a great mountain? Yeah, great like a great mountain, but different than that. Okay. Well, God is powerful. Powerful like what? Well, powerful like a nuclear explosion? Well, no, but kind of. But no, something different than that. So the point is that any word we seek to describe God's existence or God's nature, we're always going to say, yeah, but no, right? So then the philosopher takes that critique to its endpoint to say, well, look, all language we use, therefore, about God is going to not only be incomplete, it ultimately won't be describing that which you think it's describing because of the nature of that which you are seeking to describe and the nature of human language and its limits. So that's a serious critique. That's a really serious critique. It's not an easy one to address, but there's really, really smart people in our tradition who have addressed it. So we'll leave that on the table for now and rejoin it in just a moment. The other critique actually comes from within Christianity itself, and it's the critique of what's called fideism, and this comes primarily from Protestant, although there's exceptions, but primarily from Protestant perspectives of the nature of God. So this is coming from faithful Christians, people who believe in the divinity of Christ, who believe in the resurrection, who believe in most of the same things that we as Catholics believe. But this is a massive difference. People from this persuasion argue that there's three reasons that we can't make arguments for God's existence. I mean, we can't use our reason to try and demonstrate that God exists. One, because they argue of the nature of God. Now, God typically is understood as having kind of two powers or two characteristics that have to be understood in relationship to each other. One of them is God is understood, as St. Thomas Aquinas puts it, as the eternal law. So as changeless, as timeless, as necessarily existing. And we're going to get in that today. And this is associated with God as sort of pure reason or pure truth. Now, the Protestant critique of that conception of God, and this gets into somewhat into the weeds of intellectual history, is that if we think about God too much in terms of reason or too much in terms of mind, then the danger is that we limit God's freedom. We start describing God as if God is like an eternal principle, almost like a form of deism that can't act or can't choose and then therefore can't love, and so therefore can't have a personal relationship. So the more Protestant conception of God is linked to an older school of philosophy called nominalism, which for our sakes and purposes, all we care about is the definition of God from this perspective is primarily as will, as absolute freedom. So God is that which is the only I in existence, pure subjectivity. So God does what God wills. God is not bound by any strictures or structures or rational nature, anything like that. God is sheer power, right? Now, if that's true, then that means that the human mind is not going to be capable at all of sort of working its way up through an intellectual staircase to try and grasp some kind of eternal truth that is God. Because God is that which can choose to be that which God chooses to be. And so there's a kind of dynamism in that conception of God that you can never capture, right? You can't grab onto it and say, got it, that's God. So don't even try. So you see, by shifting the definition of God, you're going to limit the possibility of the human mind to be able to know God. So that's one reason. That's reason A there. There's also a hyper sensitivity within the Protestant traditions in general to the limits of human reason. Saying, look, any attempt that we make to describe this God, to demonstrate the existence of this God, is also doomed to fail because we are puny little creatures who simply just don't have the capacity to understand God, to identify God. And therefore, anything that we say about God is not only going to, again, be incomplete, it's going to be false. So because of the finitude of our mind, we can't grasp God. That's closely related, but different to the third reason here, is that from the Protestant traditions in general, they interpret the effects of original sin, the fall, the reason that all human beings are in a sense, are born into sin. It's not a part of our original nature, but it's a part of our acquired nature as human beings. That has affected our minds, that has darkened our minds to the point that not only are we finite, not only do we have limitations because we're creatures, because we're not God, but within those limitations, we are also prone to idolatry, to define things that are God that actually aren't God, but some self-serving idol of our own creation that we call God when in fact it's just a projection of ourselves onto the sky. So therefore, sort of the sum of these three critiques together, which takes the form of fideism, leads to the conclusion that, the only place you can find God is where God finds you. And where's the only place God finds you from a generic Protestant perspective? In the Bible. So there, you see, this starts to make sense now. Oh, well, that's why you have this particular trajectory within these diverse interpretations of Protestantism, but they all share this, right? Bible believing, Bible believing, Bible believing. And what they mean in particular, Catholics, of course, are Bible believing as well, but their Bible believing is against, again, I have to be careful here because there's lots of diversity within Protestantism, but in general, their Bible believing is within this backdrop right here. So those are serious theological critiques. We can't just brush them off and say, well, obviously that's not the case, because we're getting at the heart of how we conceive of God, not only generally, but also particularly the God in the Christian tradition. So, the philosopher's critique and the Protestant's critique.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
We have some responses, however. First, the response to the philosopher's critique. It is true. It's like absolutely right that we cannot and should not ever say that we're speaking about God univocally, meaning that our words have a one-to-one correspondence and our concepts have a one-to-one correspondence with the actual nature of God. That would be idolatry. And that is, it's dangerous and it's wrong, because we're going to start creating false gods if we believe that our words are going to absolutely capture the nature of God. We have to recognize that. But, and this is a big one, we can speak analogically about God. So what is an analogy? Go back to your old test preparation days. Right? An analogy is a similarity and a difference holding two different concepts or two different realities together. It's a bridge. Analogies are bridges. So when you're constructing the bridge, you're both recognizing that you're talking about two different things, but also recognizing that there's a shared structure between them that makes it possible to speak about them in relationship to each other. So our speech about God is certainly going to be limited, but that doesn't mean it's going to be vacuous or empty. It's going to have real content because of the possibilities we have to speak analogically about God. And then the question is, well, why can we do that? Well, as we'll see as we get deeper into the argument, one of the reasons we can do that is because God created us, and we are a part of creation. So, for example, when I say God creates the universe, and Matt creates a PowerPoint, obviously the verb create there means different things applied to those different nouns, right? And yet there's still some possibility of establishing some kind of connection because we have the ground of creation itself, which is a part of the structure of all reality. So I'm not just making it up. There's actually a way to establish that bridge. So we have to be careful. We have to walk with care as we approach the discussion about the possibility of demonstrating the existence of God. But we can also walk with some confidence, precisely because we're talking about a God who creates, and as a bonus, we're also made in the image and likeness of God, which adds additional possibilities to our own capacity to know God and describe God as creatures made by Him. So it is possible. That gets to the philosopher's critique. How about the Protestant critique? Well, as I noted at the very beginning, God classically has been understood, especially within the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, as both reason and will, and that it's an error only to see it as will. And here's why. I remember I was in Sunday school once, and I was a smart aleck, and now the arc of justice is long, and now God has provided me children who are doing the same things that I used to do. And I said, okay, and my dad was actually the teacher. I said, Dad, if God is all-powerful, then God could choose not to be God, right? I'm like, gotcha. I'm the smartest man alive, right? Now, to be fair, you can see where that could be conceptually problematic. Well, I am saying that God's all-powerful, and if all-powerful means that there's no restrictions on God's freedom to do whatever God wants, then God theoretically could choose to be God and not God at the same time. Or God could choose to create a mathematical formula in which zeros and ones become the same thing, because God is God. Well, Thomas Aquinas anticipates that. These are the smart alecks of the world, and says God is omnipotent, but God is omnipotent, and there's some necessary features of what it means to be God that God cannot cancel because God would not be God in doing them. So, for example, one of the necessary features of God is existence. So God is. And as I've mentioned this many times before, but the Old Testament picks up on that philosophical insight by giving God the name of Yahweh, which is translated as I am that I am. My name is isness, right? My name is to be. And so by the very definition of God, God is that which is. And so if you're talking about that which is not, you're necessarily not talking about God by definition. And so my teenager smart aleck question, it sort of dissolves upon just a simple definition of the term of which I am seeking to describe. So for that reason, we can't define God surely as pure will. It's an incoherent definition. That will is a will within the conceptual parameters of reason itself. And so God is reason and will. Now what that's going to mean is that our reason will be, which is, we didn't come up with our reason, we didn't create our reason will be able to participate in the reason of God's own existence, which is what will be able to establish that bridge between our Creator and us. So by resetting the definition of God to its correct conceptual foundations, that then gives us the opportunity to speak rationally about God again. It's absolutely true that human reason can only have a partial understanding of God. But partial doesn't mean nothing, right? It's not an all or nothing affair here. Of course, we're not going to get everything. That's absolutely true, but we can get something, and that which we see is actually the real God. It's not the totality of God. We don't need to embrace the totality of God's existence in order to know, for example, that God exists and that God is the ground of all of existence and our final good as well. So point granted that we can't know the totality of God, but we can know something about God, especially because God is our Creator and because we are created with a likeness to God. We share in a special way, in a unique way, with God's own existence. Finally, the Catholic tradition recognizes that sin does indeed damage our natural, rational, intellectual capacities. They are damaged. And we do have a tendency, a universal tendency, to create false gods. And it's one that is very well documented biblically, but also one that we can sort of see just experientially. And so, of course, we have to recognize that our reason can be abused and that our reason can create illusions of God. But to say that sin has that effect does not mean that sin has totally wiped away our created nature. Remember, go back to your Genesis here. We're made in the image and likeness of God. We're made, like everything else in creation, fundamentally good. And that makes sense, right? Because if God is good in and of himself, right, and God creates, then all creation not only participates in that goodness, but cannot have a shred of evil within it because there's no evil in God. And so we remain good, damaged, but good. There's a very important implication here as well, because if it's true that reason has no capacity to apprehend God, none, then that means that the only way we can understand God, the only way we can know God, which is a condition for loving God, is encountering God in the Bible, which immediately means what? That those who've never encountered God in the Bible, by definition, can know nothing about God, period. But even potentially more problematic than that, if our sin is so perverse, then not only does God necessarily communicate himself in and through the Bible, meaning that's the only way that we can know him, but these traditions also say, and that the only way you can actually even recognize God in the Bible is itself also a gift of grace, meaning you don't participate in it. Put most basically, God does all the work. God does the work in communicating with you through the Bible. God does the work of illuminating your mind in terms of making it possible for you to understand that which is revealed. So then the question is where are you? Where am I? Where, to put it bluntly, are any of us free? And how is this a relationship with God and not a kind of cosmic relationship between an owner and his pets, right? So there's implications for all of these views. And if we ramp up sin so high that we have no natural capacity to know God, then the question is whether or not we're even individuals anymore and can make any decisions about our relationship with God. So the Catholic tradition has always recognized that there's always remained, at the intellectual level and at the level of the will, a free relationship between God and humanity, notwithstanding the real existence of sin. So these questions, these are serious critiques, but they have very good answers to them. So the point of all this, as I said before, is is metaphysics still lives, still alive. We should still be teaching it. We should still be studying it. It's difficult. It's really difficult. At times it's mind-boggling difficult, and you'll see that it's easy to get the brain tied up into a pretzel. So it's hard. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but it's possible. It's hard, but it's possible. And so insofar as it's possible, it lives on. What God is, as I've noted in his entirety, that truly is ineffable. It's beyond all of our attempts to define it. But that God is, that God exists, that is certainly within the bounds of what we can say and should be able to say. So in short, we do not have to choose between what's typically called revelation, so how God communicates us in and through Scripture, in and through the church. We don't have to choose between that. We don't have to be the revelation Christians versus the natural theology Christians. Natural theology understood as the ways that we can seek to speak about God by using the reason that God has given us. And again, the basic principle here is that, and this is one that Thomas Aquinas identifies, is that grace, so however God is going to work in our life in and through the Spirit, in and through the church, in and through the sacraments, that is going to be completing that which is already there. So we don't want to put God at odds with each other. We don't want to put God, the Creator, the Father, at odds with God, the Son, the Redeemer. They're not vying over us as if we're a prize between two dueling deities. It's one God, one humanity. And so grace necessarily has to be understood as working with creation. We can also see this through a Trinitarian lens as well, where all these pieces get united in participating in the eternal and internal life of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We're truth-seeking creatures naturally. We're curious. And we're not just curious about proximate things that are happening to us, like, well, you know, what is this thing that's happening right in front of me? But I want to go into that, and then beyond that, and then beyond that, and then beyond that, and beyond that. I want to know how all this works, right? One of the biggest, if not the biggest reason that people leave the church now is that they don't believe, and they think they don't believe because they think that the idea of God is not only contested, but silly and absurd. You know, like no serious person believes in God. We need to be able to identify the ultimate foundation for where not only our theological and our beliefs about reality come from, but where our moral beliefs come from. Why do we believe this is right and this is wrong, and that this is good and this is evil?